Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. I'm Dr. Brad Reedy. Today is Thursday, October 5th, 2023. Tonight's broadcast is a live Q&A. So every other broadcast, we welcome our current and alumni families of all of our programs to attend. They can share these links with their family and friends, with siblings of individuals who have gone through the program, if that's helpful, to give them support, to give them answer, to get them involved. And we take your questions. We always accept questions, requests, suggestions via our email address at webinar@evoketherapy.com. And then, of course, you can submit questions live throughout tonight's broadcast, and I'll be happy to get to those in the order that they are received. So if you're attending live, take a moment, if you have one, to enter a question into the queue. And Liv, who is facilitating me with this evening, who's helping moderate this evening, she will then pass those on in the order that they're received. Before I go on to our pre-submitted questions, I just want to make an announcement for our upcoming young adult workshop. It's going to be hosted in New York City, 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. It is going to be facilitated by my daughter, Emma Reedy, who is a fantastic facilitator. She does our training of our intensives program. She is, and I say this objectively, wise beyond her years. And anybody who's worked with her will tell you the same thing, that they have some skepticism because she's young. She's my daughter. But then after working with her, I constantly get comments, and I can see it for myself about how gifted she is as a therapist facilitator. So if you're interested in that, contact Becky, BECCI at evoketherapy.com or intensives at evoketherapy.com. With that, let's get to the pre-submitted questions. I have one already up. One says, how do you hold boundaries while also being your child's first call? I remember seeing this one at the end of the last broadcast. If the child's call is to discuss something that is a violation of the parent's boundary, what does the parent do? And so I've thought about this in the last week. I guess at times you have to make a decision about what's the priority. If the connection and the support is the priority, then you have to shift out of a behavioral model. I think what happens, I think there's this sort of curvilineal relationship, and I imagine a lot of our experienced parents could tell you the same thing. At the beginning of the therapeutic process, there's this ramping up, there's this trajectory of awareness, of skills, of involvement, a certain kind of participation in the parent-child relationship that increases. After the child has had therapy and treatment and been given tools and a lot of information, oftentimes parents will reduce their supervision, if you will, their behavioral implementation, control, reaction to their child. And so what might look like later on in your process in terms of its behavioral management, its amount of structure, what might look like what it did in the beginning will be very different, because you still have you have and your child has much more awareness. So I think part of it is, what I've learned is, it's been worth it at times to not execute some of the consequences if I were getting a more honest and transparent dialogue from my child, if I could be more helpful. Remember, the whole idea of treating an issue behaviorally is to encourage growth in our children. But if my child is coming to me with their mistakes and with their missteps, then we're having a dialogue where I can be a part of the solution. I can be a resource for the solution. So I think sometimes it has to shift. Now, I don't want to say that this must happen or needs to happen or is absolutely required. I think historically what I've said in answer to this question, kind of the old version of myself, was you don't have to change your consequences to be a safe, non-judgmental parent. The example that I love to give is, I saw an ESPN documentary years ago. And in this documentary, among other things, was a home movie of a child who passed away on the football field. And the story goes that he had received a hit the week before. He was on defense. I believe he was a linebacker, if that means anything to you. And he received a concussion the week before, but he lied and kept it from his coaches, from the doctors, and from his parents. And as a result, he experienced something called secondary concussion syndrome, where if the concussion isn't healed, the individual is at much greater risk for serious injuries, and in this case, even death. And he received a mild, moderate hit contact in the next football game. And the sad and absolutely terrifying thing was his father was taping it on a home movie at the time that his son collapsed and eventually died. But he did this to educate the public. So I use this example to say, yes, if this young man had come to his coach or his parents or the doctor and complained about the symptoms, which they would have diagnosed as a concussion, he would have been withheld from the game until he had reached a stable baseline, until the symptoms had subsided, and he would have lived. So by confessing his blurriness, his headaches, his nausea, he would have been quote unquote punished by not being allowed to play the next game. And I love that analogy because there would have been no malice, there would have been no frustration or anger on the part of the coach, the doctors, or the parents. They would have just been protecting him from the possibility of very serious injury, which of course he sustained. But for the parents or the coach to have to say, well, we're not going to follow through because you disclosed the truth to us, that's nonsense. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So at the end of the day, I guess the question is posed back to you. How can you be more safe to your child while still adhering to your own boundaries, to your own principles? And as I say, I want to make this stance a little bit more emphatic than I've made it in the recent weeks. I want to be as clear as I can. A therapist like myself can't be responsible for your decisions. And that's why I steer away from, as much as I possibly can, making strong recommendations without involving the parents and their value system and kind of coming to the conclusion of the decision with the client, with the parents, with the individual. Because the stakes are too great, too high for you to delegate, to outsource your decision, your responsibility, to abdicate the responsibility that you have as a parent. It's just too high. So I will give my recommendation based on a diagnosis, if I'm required to. But if I'm working with a parent directly, we'll come at the pros and cons, through the pros and cons of the particular decision. And there's no objective truth. Somebody just said to me the other day, if an adult client were walking out of treatment based on what they knew about me, I bet you would just let them go. And I said, not necessarily at all. I mean, I can't even answer that question because there are too many variables. There's the history and treatment. There's the history between me and the client. There's how much awareness they have. There's their age. There's their risk level. There are a nearly infinite number of variables that would lead to my decision in that case. So I don't know. What I do know is that I don't have a generic answer for that. What I do know as a clinician and a father and a human being is that my decision is a creative place that I arrive at after I do my best to understand all of the context, all of the variables. So people ask me every once in a while, if it were your child, what would you do? And that's nearly an impossible question to answer also, because just on the simplest level, I'm myself. My child is my child. I won't even make the same decision with my 4 children with the same behavior, right? It depends on their age, their awareness, the history, a whole host of variables. So I don't think we as therapists, even me as a podcaster or a webinar creator, I don't think it's my job to tell you what to do. I really don't. I think that flies in the face of the fundamental concept that I believe is at the heart of psychotherapy, which is to discover your truth, to discover your values, to discover who you are, and to expand. Right? I think about my capacity today at 55 years old. My capacity is much greater than it was at 30 years old. So if you looked at my parenting 25 years ago with my now 30-year-old son and my 29-year-old daughter, you would say that person is a different person than the person that I see before me today, making different decisions with his 15-year-old. And my response would be, I am a different person. I have a different baseline level of anxiety and fear. I have a different skill set, much more advanced than I was 24 years ago. I sure hope so. My children, because of my growth and evolution, my wife's growth and evolution, they've been exposed to new information, new concepts. Society has changed, and the list goes on and on. But what I can do, and it was the genesis of what gave me permission as a starting off point for the journey of the heroic parent, my first book. What I realize is it's my job not to give somebody the truth, not to be the expert in somebody's life, but help them develop a discipline, a way of thinking, a sensibility, an awareness to be able to be their own expert, to be able to parse out the difference between their trauma responses, their anxiety if it rises to a clinical level, and kind of their natural reaction. So I know that sounds very vague and obtuse, but I can't be more clear than to say it's not my job to tell you what to do. And so I put the question back to you. How do you? And I will tell you this. My answer to your question today is different than it was even 5 years ago. But that's because of my own evolution, my own growth, the depth that I have in my soul, in my psyche. So thanks for the question. Very, very tough one. All right. Somebody writes in and says, how do you focus on building an attachment with an adopted child diagnosed with reactive attachment disorder? I'm so glad that you asked this question. Remember this about attachment. Attachment isn't sameness. Attachment isn't bringing the child to where you're at. Attachment is meeting the child where they're at. So how would you build, foster, and encourage an attachment with a child who suffers from reactive attachment disorder? You would do your work. You would get your support. You would surround yourself with resources and emotional support. You would find places where you could, for lack of a better word, complain and grieve and vent. You would do all of that self-care so that you could be there for somebody who is diagnostically compromised. Attachment isn't imposing on the child some kind of ideal. Attachment is, first and foremost, getting grounded and healed in yourself, recognizing that the primary responsibility in parenting is to know thyself. And with that, to take responsibility for the regulation of your own nervous system, your own fight or flight, your own anxiety, your own depression, your own self-medication practices. That's the first responsibility, to establish a base, kind of this place from which you operate. And then from there, how can I support my child while still maintaining that base, that base of who I am? In a less severe example, what I have learned about my teenage child, what my teenage child has taught me, is a better way to say it, is my teenage child loves that I drive her to school. That's her favorite thing. She really does. She prefers that I drive her to school every morning. It's a great way for her to start off the day. And you know why? Because I don't say anything necessarily, unless something is really interesting to me that I'm thinking about or listening to or that I see on the road. I don't pry. I don't require something of her. I don't take my anxiety and try to gain information about what's going on inside of her head. I don't make her responsible for it. Some days we have great conversations. I mean, there are days that we fight and get into problems. That happens too. But speaking of the good days, there are days when we don't say almost anything the entire time. We just listen to music. There are days when we have a very interesting and in-depth conversation. So in this way of thinking, my attachment is meeting her where she is at. And of course, virtually, essentially, there's nothing in that 10, 15-minute car ride to school that is high stakes. There's just nothing. If there was, we would be having a different conversation. Because of that, or along with that, in that context, I don't need anything from her. I mean, I'm not too much of a morning person anyway. So I'm not in the mood oftentimes for a big, lengthy, in-depth conversation. But when I hear parents or couples say, I want to hear what's going on, that's your need, not theirs. I can't be more clear and emphatic. Your need might be to hear from your spouse or from your child, but that's not necessarily their need. And for teenagers, just speaking developmentally, it is their need to be separate from us. It is their need to have to be able to manage the boundary and the doorway into them. And so if you have a need to know what's going on inside of your partner's or your child's mind, what they're thinking, what they're feeling, it might be important for you to explore and identify ways that you can get your need met without prying, without being intrusive, without demanding, without requiring, without vilifying them that they're not expressive or they don't talk. Because that actually might be exactly the most appropriate place for them to be in that moment or at that developmental stage. The second question that comes when somebody's not expressive is, I wonder if I'm not a safe person to talk to. If my daughter, for example, we're driving to school, if she sees some schoolmate and she says, I hate that kid. If I go right into a lecture about the burden of hate or how anger is the poison that you take, hoping somebody else will suffer, she's not going to talk to me. If I say something like, we don't use the word hate, she's not going to talk to me. I remember my therapist said for many years that a lot of her friends and her associates would complain to her, would accuse her of not parenting well. How do you let, she would tell me, how do you let your son talk to you that way? She would hear. And my therapist would say back, I'm just glad that he's talking to me. And I have a tolerance that I can put up with a little bit messier of an expression or a conversation than others. And with that, you see, with that expansion, and this goes back to that first question, I then get to hear more. It's like I feel in therapy or parenting. It's not just about identifying somebody's issues. With some basic training, we can all identify other people's issues and pathologies. I always say to young therapists that I'm training, that doesn't take much intelligence or talent to be able to identify somebody's defenses, somebody's issues. But what starts to require more talent is to be able to prioritize what's important. Can I not talk? Can I not teach? Can I not lecture? Right? The master therapist, as I've said many times, and I was taught this by somebody else, the master therapist prides themselves on what they don't say. If I listen to somebody in therapy and I'm stopping them every 30 to 60 seconds, pointing out a thinking error, pointing out some, excuse me, pointing out some distortion, some thought issue, some pathology. After a while, they're just going to shut down. But I'd rather listen to somebody talk for 45 minutes and then give one idea for them to digest. One perspective, one interpretation. Especially if there's a power differential, as there always is in parenting, as there always is in psychotherapy. Otherwise, it feels oppressive and unsafe. So thank you. Somebody says, my 15-year-old daughter leaves Evoke next week. Our plan is to pick her up, take her to the hotel where she can take a shower, then buy some clothes and rest. We'll drop her off at the therapeutic boarding school the next morning, which is 10 minutes from Evoke. She's not the same kid who was when she arrived at Evoke. She's not violent. She was violent with transporters. But I'm still concerned about her becoming unregulated in a short time we'll be with her. Any words of advice? Great question. First of all, I have a couple of broadcasts on transitioning. And so I would encourage you to go to our podcast site if you want I don't know, Liv, if you have access to our spreadsheet with all of them, but you can search it. I should teach you how to do that if you don't know how, so that you can pull up the episode number. But you can look at some of the couple of broadcasts that I've done on transition. But here are my thoughts. Here are the highlights of those broadcasts. I would encourage you to come into the transition period open-minded, being curious about how well she will or won't do. There's a difference between being open-minded and being curious about how she will do something, or how well she'll succeed, or what she won't do, or how she won't respond. I think I know there's a fundamentally different energy in that versus I hope she does well. I'm worried that she won't. That energy, that tension will become a part of the problem. Most important is that you get her from point A to point B. And if she regresses as you're predicting or worried that she might, that's good data. In fact, I used to say to my clients all the time, to make this transition most successful, I would say to them, make it hard for your parents to drop you off, not easy. Make them question, I would teach them, make them question the need for aftercare, not confirm the decision. And do that by responding well. So for me, it goes back to this idea that it's good if it goes well and it's good if it goes poorly. That's a really important approach that I really strongly encourage you to take. That's the first principle. Release your expectations, use it as assessment. And the assessment is neither good or bad, it just is what it is. That's the first thing. The second thing is focus on your regression. Focus on your nervous system regulation. Focus on whether you get triggered to go back into old patterns. I tell the story about a mother who called me during one such transport with her son. And she said, he went back into old patterns eventually. Not at first, but eventually he went back into old patterns. But before I could interrupt or ask more questions, she said, but that's not why I'm talking to you. That's not why I'm sharing it. What I want to share with you is I responded differently. And I'm so happy. And that pride that she had in her growth overshadowed what her son did by a long way. And that's what this healing process looks like in a parenting paradigm. The child is the child. The child is not you. The child is not yours. Your responsibility is how you respond. It's like the old step parenting manual. I love the tagline on the systematic training and effective parenting manual that I saw 27 years ago. It said, the challenge in parenting teenagers is to focus on changing yourself, not the teenager. So the first point is come with no expectations. If it's good, it's good. If it's bad, it's good. And then the second thing is focus on how you deal with whatever comes up. Make that the most important area of focus for you. And that little concept, that little tool, that little technique, it expands into a greater idea and understanding of parenting, which is you can't control your child. You can only respond. You can only change how you respond. It is the thesis, essentially, of the journey of the heroic parent, which is that healthy parenting doesn't produce well-behaved children. Healthy parenting is its own reward. Healthy parenting is its own reward. The result of healthy parenting, not being well-behaved children, is greater peace, greater confidence, less depression, less anxiety, less reactivity, more clarity, more courage, more grounding. And then the most amazing thing is when I talk about this, parent education doesn't change children, but rather parent education changes parents. And that change in a parent will have amazing and wonderful ripple effects on the child. So yeah, it's a great question, a common question. And those are my ideas, which I expound on, of course, a lot more during the broadcast that I mentioned earlier on transitioning. All right. Are there any other questions? No other questions? I'll go over upcoming announcements and issues. Like I said, we have the Young Adult Workshop on November 4th, 10 a.m. to 5 p.m., run by Emma Reedy. Very inexpensive, $50 for the day. Contact intensives at evoketherapy.com or Becky at evoketherapy.com. It's BECCI at evoketherapy.com to learn more. Run by the incomparable Emma Reedy, my daughter. If you want to do a deep dive into your own work, next week we have Finding You. There is a space available in the Finding You. I spoke at a conference this week, and I said to the 250 people that attended my session, I started off with, you all need therapy. If you're asking parents to go to therapy, if you're, of course, running a therapeutic program or work at a therapeutic program and you're not going to therapy, you're doing them a disservice. You won't know the difference between your issues and their issues. And it is critical that you do. And you can only take people as far as you can go. I will tell you that if you want to know what's my secret, what's the secret to all of this, do your work. And intensives are a great jumping off point. And just to be clear, to remove any doubt about the conflict of interest, if you don't want to go to evoke therapy programs, intensives, which I am partial to, of course, go to onsite. I've been to onsite many times. Onsite in Tennessee. Go to the Bridge to Recovery in Kentucky. Go to the Survivors Program at the Meadows in Arizona. Go to the Caring Foundation Breakthrough Program in Pennsylvania. Go to the House of Ocala with Judy Crane in Florida. So if there's any concern, any conflict of interest, go to somebody else's program. Sorry about my dog barking in the background. But if you want to go to ours, October 18th is the next in-person offering, followed by November 8th through 12th. We have a November 10th through 12th online version of it, which is about half of the time and about a third of the cost. So if time and money are factors, the online version is a wonderful option. We have Returning to You, the sequel. The October 25th through 29th was full. I think it might have opened up. I think somebody might have moved to the March session. So the next one will be March 6th. That will fill up. The October one has been full with a waiting list for some time. Contact intensives at evoketherapy.com to find out more about either of those sequels. We have that young adult intensive I mentioned in New York, and then I'm doing the Finding Connection workshop, the 4-couple workshop, Finding You for couples, February 7th through 11th next year. We also have custom programs for couples, co-parents, and families, and you can contact our intensives at evoketherapy.com to learn more about that. I just finished the Conscious Parenting Seminar. We have a new version of that. I love doing it last Friday. It was wonderful. We have support groups. There's one that's starting in just a half an hour, 7 p.m. Mountain Time. October 12th is the next one. This is for all current and alumni families. Once a month, we have an alumni-only meeting. October 24th at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time is that offering. And then once a month, we have an intensive support group. October 10th at 6 p.m. Mountain Time is that offering. Go to our website at evoketherapy.com/family-involvement for more information. If you want to do an experiential process with your child in the wilderness, this is our Family Treks offering. It's a 3 to 4 day, could be customized, could be variable, could happen in the middle of your child's program, at the end. It could happen even if you haven't had a child at Evoke. Contact admissions at evoketherapy.com to learn more or talk to your child's Evoke therapist. If you want a coach that can work with you virtually anywhere in the world, contact coaching at evoketherapy.com. These are our therapists and coaches, parent coaches that can work with you virtually. Parents, couples, families, or individuals, stage of life, codependency, depression, anxiety, a host of issues they can help and support you with. We ask all current parents to try 6 of any combination of the following support groups: Al-Anon.org, CODA.org, CODA.org, FamiliesAnonymous.org, or AdultChildren.org. Just 6. And like I said to the group of professionals that I spoke to earlier this week in San Diego, if you learn nothing else, you know what it feels like to walk into a meeting and to be asked to share personal issues with complete strangers. The compassion and empathy that it gives you for your child is profound. And people that don't do this have the same exact excuses that their children have. It doesn't apply to me. The people that attend these are different than I am. I'm doing fine. I don't have a problem. Right? It's the same resistance. It's the same resistance. Also, refugerecovery.org and NAMI.org are great options to get free resources and classes in your local communities. All of these broadcasts are available on the podcast app or Spotify. Just search Finding You in Evoke Therapy Podcast or go to soundcloud.com on your computer and search for Finding You there. You can also go to Evoke's YouTube channel and watch the rebroadcast of the video versions of these broadcasts. You can find Evoke Therapy Programs and me, Dr. Brad Reedy, on Twitter, Threads, and Instagram using the handle @EvokeTherapy and @Dr. Brad Reedy, respectively. You can find Evoke Intensives on Instagram using the handle @EvokeTherapyIntensives. And on Facebook, you can find us by searching Evoke Therapy Programs or Evoke Therapy Intensives. Also, check out our blog with new content each week. If you want to give back to organizations that support people that can't afford treatment, we collaborate with and donate to ChooseMentalHealth.org, Sky'sTheLimitFund.org, and the EvokeFamilyFoundation.org. You can earmark your donations, your tax-deductible donations, for a specific program or a specific population. All right, looks like I've got some questions that have come in, so I'll get to those. Somebody writes, please share your thoughts on a number of phone calls for wilderness students with parents. Curious as to why some therapists allow multiple calls per week between parent and student, or at least one per week, while another therapist may arrange 1 or 2 calls total for the entire stay in the wilderness. I suppose I would ask the therapist that. It's supposed to be, if I had a group of 9 students myself, my average would probably be that every student gets 2, maybe 3, 2.5 phone calls during their stay. That means that some get none and some get 4 or 5. So sometimes it's dependent upon the child. Now, if consistently a particular therapist is going far away from that, then that's a question for me to know about. That's a question for me to ask them about. I will tell you this, early in my career, I was more conservative with phone calls. I wanted children to reach a certain level of functioning so that they weren't going to use that phone call to go back into old manipulative behaviors with their parents. I learned from other people that doing that work in real time was more helpful. While it made it hard in the moment, it made it better over the long run. So if you have questions about your therapist, if you think that they have a bias toward none, let me know that. I'm happy to become involved and answer questions and consult with that therapist. And again, maybe their answer is that it's unique to your child, unique to your family. It also could have something to do with you. Sometimes parents are more fragile. Sometimes parents are more prone to reactive responses to their child. That will change. That will change my perspective on the numbers and the frequency of phone calls with the child. So as always, there's a lot of variables. There's no generic template. But if there are trends that are strongly away from the typical, that makes me real curious. But otherwise, it would be about those variables, because even myself, who learned to use phone calls pretty liberally, would still have students that might have 0 or just 1 phone call with their parent. That would not be out of the question at all with a group of 9 students, 9 clients. Somebody writes, are there any tips to speaking with a 19-year-old that wants to box but is having trouble realizing we expect him to also have a job? He's often has big ideas that we don't squelch, but he is having trouble moving forward without going to school. Just tips in helping move forward without lecturing or telling him he can't do what he dreams. He is rarely accountable and is supposed to find his way with our support for 3 months. I suppose my tips are, I would suspend judgment about, I wouldn't get into the details about boxing. I wouldn't. The boxing dream is irrelevant. I mean, as strange as it sounds, I had a dream to become a psychotherapist. And I did what it took, including in my case, supporting myself and putting myself through college, which was common back then. And it maybe today is a little bit less common, especially with the population that I work with. But I wouldn't get hung up on the boxing part of it. That's irrelevant almost. I would focus on what you need from him. If he can box and still meet the expectations that that you're setting forth for him to do, like get a job or do whatever, focus on that, not the boxing. And if he says, well, that's getting in the way of my boxing, he's going to have to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and do some extra training. He's going to find the best idea is non-judgment about what they're saying that they want to do, but sticking to what your values and your boundaries and the principles that you want to live by are. But when we get into debate about trying to show them the wisdom of our perspective, that's the power struggle. That's the control under which no child thrives. So if my daughter says she wants to drop out of school, my response is, that's irrelevant, but here's what I'm requiring of you: to have a car, to have freedom, to have privileges. I don't get involved in making judgments, determinations about the life that you want to live. But what I can do is set up boundaries as they relate to me and my support and where you live and how much money I provide for you. But I wouldn't get involved in the boxing aspect of it. And if he complains that it's prohibitive, I wouldn't even get involved in that conversation. The implied message would be, you're going to have to figure that out. That's not my purview about how you're going to train to become a world champion boxer, because some kids do become world champion boxers, right? Of any gender. And I wouldn't want to squelch somebody's dreams, but it doesn't mean that I have to fund it on their terms, that I have to make them accountable for nothing else, and that my boundaries are irrelevant. It's more about non-judgment and non-lecturing and not trying to control what they're thinking and what they're saying. That's the control. That's the chapter in the journey of the heroic parent, of control versus influence. The power struggle isn't the boundaries. I've seen children thrive with a wide range of boundaries and structure. I always say in our program, they often thrive. And we have more structure, boundaries than most anybody does at home. But what we don't try to control is what they think, what they feel, what they believe, what they want, what their dreams are. We don't try to control their ideas. And I think us parents are I know we are. We're very tempted to try to control a child's ideas, because if we control what they think, then we don't have to set boundaries and deal with the consequences. If I can convince you of my philosophy or my approach to a certain situation or life, I don't have to set a boundary with you. And that's why so many people, I would say the vast majority of human beings, try to control what other people think and feel and believe rather than setting boundaries, because boundaries are much, much harder to do. We have to face something much more, much darker inside of ourselves when we set boundaries, which is that we're a bad spouse or a bad parent or a bad friend or a bad employer. We have to come to terms with that and grapple with that. But lecturing, pleading, begging, threatening, nagging, all of those are substitutes for boundaries. So those are my thoughts, my I guess you could say tips. And then always, as always, with all of this, be open to expansion, not capitulation because of guilt or anxiety, but understand that trying things outside of the box can be okay if it's coming from a grounded place. And that's why I think it's so important to work with a therapist or a parent coach, because intuition is mistaken for trauma response sometimes, right? Living by intuition, living by gut, living by what your heart knows is wonderful. But really, for that to be most effective, authentic, clear, creative, and courageous, you have to sort out your trauma. Because for a traumatized person responding from a trauma response, a place of trauma, intuition is confused and mixed up and backwards. But when somebody's healing and in recovery and working on themselves, to trust your intuition is wisdom. So it's important not for me to know the difference between those two things in you. It's very important for you to know the difference between those two things in you. Very important. All right. Is that it for this evening, Livy? All right. I hope that was helpful, folks. Good to see some old friends on the list of attendees. Thank you for joining me. My next broadcast will be October 10th at 6 p.m. Mountain Time. I'll be talking about I'll be talking about trauma and insecure attachment, how not to pass it on in parenting. Really, really, really love this topic. All right, folks, thanks for joining me. I hope this is a helpful point of contact. You can always reach out to us at webinar@evoketherapy.com. Questions, suggestions, advice, topics. We will welcome those and respond as we can. And for and on behalf of the people that you love and the people that love you, thank you for showing up and being willing to do this work. Have a great evening, and I'll talk to you next week. Take care. Bye-bye.